Hi folks, thanks for sticking around again to listen to me talk a bit more about where I am this weekend. Yeah, unfortunately I had to cut the trip a little bit short. I'm not having much luck with the tent poles and all last week. But yeah, I really didn't want that tent collapsing on me tonight. So that's just how it goes sometimes. I still had a really good weekend. But yeah, we are over on the west coast, on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, and as you'll have seen, I've been camping on the beach there, and I'm right beside an Atlantic Oakwood remnant. And I'm not sure of the history of this place. I'm not sure who owns this forest now. It's not Forestry and Land Scotland or any government body. It used to be the MOD, but it's not anymore. So I think it's probably in the hands of a private estate, or perhaps some kind of crofting ownership. But throughout this whole area there should be Atlantic Oakwood covering this peninsula, but there isn't. It's been cleared at some point and planted with non-native conifers, and that was probably in the 60s, 70s, 80s maybe. But the conifer forest itself is quite mixed. It's not just a pure Sitka spruce block that someone's planted and left. There's different things going on. Some of the trees are quite big as well. So I don't think it's your standard sort of old Forestry Commission block, which makes it a bit more interesting, to be honest. I wish I knew the history. But I'll show in a clip just now that basically what's happened is the Atlantic Oakwood has been cleared at some point. Could have been decades and decades before, and planted up with the non-native conifers. This is quite a good view showing what I was talking about. So historically this whole area would have had the Atlantic Oakwood on it. It's obviously been cleared at some point and the non-native conifers planted, and you can see where the conifers stop at the top of the hill, and that must have been the end of the easy ground, and the steeper, rockier stuff that would have been too hard to clear or manage has been left, and the trees have survived. So I guess I'll start with explaining what Atlantic Oakwood is. And it's basically a fringe of woodland that grows on the Atlantic seaboard of the UK. And that's where it gets its name from. It's an oak woodland, obviously, but it also includes a lot of birch and rowan, and sometimes birch can dominate the woodland more than the oak. You might get ash as well, alder, but it's primarily broadleaf dominated. And it's sessile oak in the north, but as you get further south, into Wales, other places, it could be pedunculate oak too. And another characteristic of these woodlands is the bryophytes. They're dominated by lichens and mosses, and you'll find it on everything, on the trunks, on the rocks. But because of where they are, right on the west coast, and they're getting hammered by the prevailing wind all the time, the trees end up being very stunted and twisted and gnarled, and yeah, you end up with this quite interesting looking woodland. Look at the shape of these birch trees. It's absolutely wind blasted. You can tell which way the wind's coming in. And this is really characteristic of the sort of native Atlantic Oakwood that should cover a lot of the northwest coast. This is a non-native Sitka spruce that's basically encroaching onto the dunes. Non-native species. But hopefully you can see that on one side of this tree the needles are all brown, and basically it's getting sandblasted by the wind coming off the sea, and also that salt air as well, and it's just killing off the growth on that side of the tree. And as that happens more and more, you get that flagging effect where you can see, just like a flag in the wind, you can tell which way the wind's coming because the growth is on the opposite side. Yeah, you can see the difference in the the green growth over this side and the brown on the other side, and eventually this tree will become very one-sided. Now this is quite a good example of the flagging effect in a group. So you can see that the tree on the outer edge is the smallest, and it gradually just gets taller and taller as it goes up. And basically the tree at the front is taking the brunt of it, and then the next row are able to grow slightly more and slightly more and slightly more. And this one right here is really getting hammered. That's a really good example of the flagging effect. Here's that same tree a bit closer. And many of these remnants exist where crofting dominates, and historically a lot of them were cleared for firewood, for farming, crofting, sheep, and we've lost them completely. Some of them hang on, but we don't have much of it left, unfortunately. And a lot of the ones we do have left, sheep are still allowed to roam throughout them, and we basically don't get any natural regeneration. And much like the pine woods I've talked about that don't get any natural regeneration, they're basically dying on their feet. If you're not recruiting new growth, then the forest doesn't exist forever. So this is quite typical of Atlantic Oakwood remnants in the UK, especially up in Scotland. They tend to be where crofting was the dominant land use on the west coast, which obviously involves sheep. And any remnants that have survived usually have sheep allowed to roam through them. So they essentially become like a wood pasture, and there's no regeneration coming in at all. The sheep will just eat any new growth. And also historically these areas would have been coppiced for charcoal and firewood and things like that, so you get a lot of multi-stemmed trees as well. And for those who don't know what coppicing is, it's just where you cut the tree at its base and it naturally sprouts new growth from that, but it tends to be multiple stemmed rather than single stemmed after that. Other issues that they face, and it's very obvious in this area, is because they're so close to non-native conifer plantations. The species in these conifer plantations are quite aggressive, and they can regenerate in a surprising range of soil. And as you've seen, there's Sitka spruce regenerating all over the dunes here and through the oak woodland itself. And if these are left, then eventually over time it will just get dominated by these conifers, and they'll shade out what's here. And again, you're just going to end up losing the woodland over time. But it's not easy to keep on top of, non-native regen. If there's no plans to fell that plantation, then it's just going to be a constant wave of regeneration, and there's almost no point coming in here trying to clear up bits and pieces until something's done with the main plantation. Another issue in the west coast is historically some of the bigger estates and around the estate houses and gardens, they would plant a species called rhododendron, and rhododendron is favoured because it grows quite easily. Again, it can tolerate a range of habitats. It has nice, bright, big pink flowers for maybe 3 or 4 weeks of the year, I think it is. And yeah, these estates have planted up their gardens with them, but rhododendron is incredibly aggressive and it spreads quickly. It's a nightmare to get rid of. People spend millions of pounds every year trying to get on top of it, but it's a really hardy plant, and once it's in, it's almost impossible to get rid of. But that's another threat to these woodlands, because they're broadleaf, they're quite open, and there's a lot of light, and the sheep are keeping the sort of competing vegetation down, so it's very easy for rhododendron to break into these places and just get out of control. It's not so much of an issue in this one that I've seen, but if you look out around the west coast when you're travelling around, rhododendron is a massive problem in a lot of places. One of the neat tricks that rhododendron does is it almost contaminates the soil around it and makes it inhospitable to anything else to grow. It's very shade tolerant, so it can grow quite densely, kind of packed in on top of each other, and it just means that nothing else can grow in or around it, which is, evolutionary wise, that's impressive, but for us here in its non-native habitat, it's a real big problem. I suppose another thing I wanted to mention quickly is crofting itself. It's probably going to sound quite controversial to some, but if I had my way, I would most likely get rid of crofting altogether. I feel like crofting as a land use, people were obviously treated terribly in the past during the clearances, but I feel like crofting almost hides behind that today, and there's this urge to carry on with this cultural land use, but it's not actually contributing anything to the land anymore. People lived that way in the past because they had to. People don't have to live that way these days. And take sheep for example. The sheep in these crofting areas contribute virtually nothing to food production in the UK, especially compared to areas in the south of England. And most crofters aren't really making an income from their sheep because it's hard to raise livestock productively in these harsh areas of northwest. So a lot of it is heavily subsidised. So you just think, we're paying people to keep sheep on the land. It doesn't really contribute anything to food production, all in the name of a cultural land use, and meanwhile the environment around it is just suffering. You take sheep off these areas and it allows woodland and natural vegetation to regenerate, which should benefit everyone. And I mean, I don't know, you could almost just pay people to take the sheep off the land instead of paying them to keep it. At least we would see some benefit of that. And I know that's not sustainable in the long term, but it would be a start, you know. And I suppose once you get these woodlands to a certain point, you don't necessarily have to exclude sheep forever. You could bring them back in and have a mix of both, you know. And I know some people will say, well, what about woodland crofts? And I feel like woodland crofts are quite weak. It's almost like people, you know, I'll plant a few trees on this croft, and it's an easy way to get cheap land and a house, basically. That might sound quite cynical, but I've lived and breathed these things for so long that I am cynical. Another frustrating thing for me is I can understand people whose families have traditionally lived here and were crofters here and they want to carry that on. I understand that, but we tend to get a lot of incomers now from south of England wanting to live this crofting lifestyle, and you just think, for what? You know, you want to kind of indulge yourself in this romantic image of crofting in the Highlands of Scotland. Again, it's not contributing anything to the land. So, you know, why start that kind of activity now? You know, think about what you're doing, what you actually want to achieve. But yeah, I'll wrap it up there. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the main video. Check all the links in the description. Hit like and subscribe if you're enjoying the videos. It really helps me out, and I will see you on the next one.